instruction at the EW Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. My colleague Amanda Sturgill will introduce herself when we get to her portion of the presentation. But my hope is just to have a few conversation starters and then turn things over to, I'd rather have a discussion than I would a lecture, because it's Saturday. Who wants to lecture on Saturday? But fake it till you make it. I think that fake news is an oxymoron for this reason. I'll tell you why. Is when you invoke the term news, I think you are giving legitimacy to whatever it is you're talking about because of the historic association of that term. And so if something's fake, I don't think it should be even in the same terminology or in the same sphere as the term news. But let's go on and see what else is out there. So where did this whole idea of fake news come from? It came from Craig Silverman, who is a respected journalist and journalism researcher. When he was doing research at Columbia, he found a made-up news site purporting to be an actual news site. It had a good title. I think it was called American News or something along those lines, and it looked legit. And he began examining the content. And if you know, Craig was able to come to our campus a few years ago for a symposium, and that's really where he made his reputation, is in finding misleading content and identifying it and trying to hold those purveyors accountable. And so he was using it in its truest sense. This is something masquerading as news, but it is a fake site. And so he's the one credited with coining the term in 2014. And of course, we all know Donald Trump is the one who weaponized the term and began to use it for reasons other than how it was originally intended as a way to bash the media. So let's test your fake news IQ here. Does anybody see anything here that could potentially be labeled fake news? Yeah, that's Putin, P-O-O-T-I-N. So is this fake news? Huh?
So it's just bad copy editing.
Bad copy editing? Well, anybody else want to jump in on whether this is fake news? Okay, depends on when it, you're like my students, right? You're afraid of answering because you're afraid of what I'm going to say to your answer. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, see if we can recognize fake news. Is this an attempt to remediate fake news? And a judge whose court I covered said, you know, the first rule in murder is you shoot them. The second rule is you shovel. And the third rule is you shut up. So that explains the art choice there. For Joe Bob. And do you realize how many people show up when you do a Google search for Joe Bob Smith? But that's not really what this panel is about. Okay, is this fake news? We have a Joe Bob Smith 25 from Roanoke and a Joe Bob Smith 25 from Electric Road in Salem. I know all caps can be difficult to read. Anybody have any thoughts on whether that's fake news?
Seems like a correction.
Seems like maybe a correction. Okay, but notice it's titled a clarification. Okay, let's look at another one. All right, so it kind of helped you out here, maybe, I don't know, but here's a tweet that has been discredited by the Russian government as being completely made up. This did not happen. Is this claim fake news? That the Russian military operation is necessary to protect Ukraine by removing the Nazis from power. Okay, I have one person. Yeah, it's not true. Okay, is that fake news?
No, it isn't, because that's what they're.
But if you put a comma,
claiming.
Okay.
put a comma,
It may be a fake statement, a false statement. But it's
Okay. So it goes to an issue of credibility of the source. Would that be fair, Mr. Becker?
yeah, but if you put a comma there, it said, you know, that whole sentence, the Kremlin said.
Okay.
It become real, not the fact of it.
Okay. Yeah, the attribution is missing. You're right.
I agree with that comment because I think the question is that news in the way that it's reported right there?
Yeah. That's.
Okay.
But if you attribute it to the Kremlin, that's what they're saying.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Thank you very much. Well, here's how journalists have traditionally seen fake news. Misleading or made up information to promote an agenda. We used to call that kind of stuff propaganda, didn't we? Until the fake news term became so ubiquitous. But how does the rest of the world see fake news? Go ahead. If it's a typo, as in the spelling of Putin, it's fake news, right? If it's an error where you attempt to clarify something that was misleading, that did not have an agenda behind it, two guys, same names, same age, live just a few miles apart, and the first time you got that grand jury list, situation happened to me, you didn't know about the existence of the other one and that they only lived a few miles apart. So an error, an inadvertent misunderstanding, or anything it doesn't like or agree with. So that's the problem of combating fake news, because anything and just about everything can fall within that domain for the audience, the mass audience that we are serving. So what do? I'm a simple person, simple-minded, so a simple approach. Stop using the term, because when we do, we give oxygen to that concept, which allows it to spread and it gives credibility. Don't share those reports. I think sometimes we think, well, did you see this? And we're sharing it. But one of the conversations in thinking about this panel and then talking with my students yesterday is, when we as journalists, we are known as journalists, what we share on social media includes an implicit endorsement of that material. Because whatever our motivation, we're saying, you need to read this. So if that is not best practices in journalism, we are still pushing people to content that is not illuminating, that is misleading, that could have an agenda behind it. So anytime that you're trying to explain a claim in a story, make sure that the definition you're using is the one that your audience understands. We're not talking about a typo here, folks. We're not talking about a misunderstanding here, folks. We're not talking about an error that occurred through no outright negligence. What we're talking about here is something that is designed to distort, to mislead, and label it and explain what your terminology is. Because we're seeing a lot of terms being floated around in a lot of contexts, and what it means to one group is not what it means to another. And we can't assume that we're all speaking the same language in terms of definitions. Thank you.
I've kind of got the second part. So hi, I'm Amanda Sturgill and I teach journalism at Elon University, which is in beautiful central North Carolina. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was the way that journalists actually make the fake news problem worse. A lot of times we like to see ourselves as victims of the fake news problem, right? That all the stuff that we're doing, even when we do the right things, people just say, oh, that's fake news, and they disregard us. But there are some things that we do, particularly in the realm of social media, that actually make the fake news problem more pernicious than we already have to deal with. Open question. Everybody is a publisher now, right? We know that since 2015, most Americans get their news from social media, right? So journalists no longer control the means of production of news in the way that most people get it, right? If you want some news to show up on this device, anyone in this room can make news that shows up on this device. So as journalists, why should anybody pay us to do anything? What do we have to offer? Yeah. Trust with the audience. Where does the trust with the audience come from? Legacy media, so reputation. Does legacy media ever make mistakes?
Sure.
What does that do to our reputation?
We're a society that forgives. So the track record, if you're doing 500, not doing 300.
Yeah, so we hope that we still have credibility, that we can still ride on the reputation of legacy media. There's lots of reputable news outlets now that don't come from legacy media, right? Lots of independent journalists, people who have, they used to be employed in legacy media and now they have a Substack or they have a Medium or something else like that, right? Still trained as journalists, still doing all those same things. right? And they're essentially our competition when we have that. So it's an interesting problem. I tell my students that we have two things left to sell to people. One of the things is that we follow a code of ethics. So when you follow someone who is a journalist, you know what you're getting ethics-wise. It doesn't mean mistakes won't happen, but at least like you know what the deal is when you go there. And the other thing is access to original sources. And I think now a lot of that is data journalism, mostly. Lots of people can watch somebody giving a speech and anybody can live tweet when the speech is broadcast live online, right? Anybody can do that. You don't need me to do that. But we can get the context behind the stories because we have more training to do that, basically. But I think it's an interesting question to think about. What do we still offer that makes it worth your dollar for your newspaper or your, you know, viewing your ads or your clicks or any of those kind of things? We know that from that ethical perspective, the first thing, right, the first line of the SPJ Code of Ethics is that we should seek truth and report it. And those two aspects, I think, are really important when we think about the fake news problem and how we can maybe not make it worse. How do you know when something is real? We had that example of Russian troops invading in Ukraine. How do you know that happened?
Depending on multiple sources.
So a bunch of people told you.
Well, different media organizations, BBC,
Okay.
followed by traditional American cable.
Or organizations that you trust gave you that information, right? Has anybody actually seen Russian troops entering Ukraine? You would come here on a very long flight today for that, right? We don't know, right? We live in a mediated world. And so for us, we have some training and we can, you know, sort of make those distinctions of what might be good information. For our audience, it might be more difficult because once they shifted over to getting all of their news on social media, the news became deconstructed for them. Right. And so a tweet from the BBC looks like a tweet from a Russian troll farm. And it can be very, very challenging for our audiences to figure that kind of thing out. Particularly when, you know, as Nerissa pointed out, news kind of went under attack as fake news with things that people don't believe or don't agree with anymore. Right. You know, that's a direct attack on that credibility that we might have hoped people would just kind of grant us for that. All right. So I feel like we do a pretty good job. I'm on the college professor kind of side of things. I feel like we've developed some pretty good techniques for fact checking. That's a robust field that's been around for a long time. The verification handbook's a good resource for that. You mentioned Craig Silverman, nice free resource. We use that at Elon to teach people for that. You know, we can teach people sort of a rubric for that. One of the things that I did over the last couple of years was think about the idea of sort of sense checking as well, which is basically when you have public figures who want to deceive people in the public, they will make statements and they will essentially violate laws of logic. But because the things that they're saying are getting live tweeted with no thinking or are getting live streamed with no intervention, they just get to say what they want. It just kind of goes right past, right? And so educating ourselves and educating our audiences in what that might be can be important. So I put Spider-Man on there because that's sort of that spidey sense that you need to develop, right? When you hear that there's something wrong with that. Gosh, I don't remember what it was. But one of your examples, it was a fallacy of fallacies, right? It was, oh yeah, it was because you spelled Putin wrong, the information must be wrong, right? That's a fallacy of fallacies, assuming that because there's a mistake, everything must be wrong to have that, right? That's that kind of spidey sense, right? That you need to develop with those things. So here's a couple examples of where logic kind of gets broken. This is a picture of a senator from Oklahoma, and he is holding a snowball on the floor of the Senate. And he is holding his snowball on the floor of the Senate because they are debating a bill related to climate change. And he is making the argument that because there was snow outside of the Senate that day, climate change is not a thing. What's wrong with that? So it's untrue, right? But what's wrong with the kind of argument that he's making there?
The difference between weather and climate.
Right, but he's not arguing that there's a difference between weather and climate. He's arguing here's a snowball, therefore climate change isn't real.
He's saying the weather is cold, so
There's no climate.
it can't be true.
That's it. It's what we call like a hasty generalization, right? Saying because I can see this one thing here, all other things must also be true. right?
It's a false story.
A snowball is really round too, you know. I don't know how hot it is in the halls of Congress, but no melting appears to be occurring. Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean,
It was
it's
a real
like,
snowball. I believe he threw it at someone and it broke up after
Yeah.
this.
so it was a real snowball?
I believe so, yeah, James
Okay.
Inifei,
Okay.
whose name I may be pronouncing wrong because I'm not in broadcasting, but anyway.
Imhoff.
Yes, you know, so here's an example, this sort of stressing of the truth by people who give speeches and are public opinion makers. It happens on both sides of the aisle. So I try to provide examples on both sides. So here is President Clinton saying, there are people who say, oh, Mr. President, I'm for a strong America. I just don't understand why you fool with the UN.
That's just a difference of opinion.
Could be, if those people exist.
I mean, I don't, but I see where you can come at it.
Yeah, someone could come at it that way. Yeah, I think in this case, it's a straw man argument, right? He's basically saying, oh, well, there's people who have this idea and my idea is better. It'd be like people saying, you know, one political party wants to take away everyone's guns or have completely open borders. Nobody has said either of those things, but they get argued against anyway, right? And they're very quotable. And we sometimes, we hear those and they're good bites and we put them in our stories, or they're good quotes and we put them in our stories, right? Because they're clicky. People like to see them.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. So disinformation in particular is very easy to spread because most people get their news here and the news is deconstructed. It gets spread by professionals, right? People get paid to create and spread disinformation. They also, there are people who do it just for fun to do that as well, right? Because they like to be agents of chaos and sort of, you know, manipulate other people and those kinds of things. The platforms themselves make it easy for the information to spread because the way that an idea becomes seen in any kind of like algorithmically sorted media, so that would be all of your social media, your search engines, any of those things. The thing that is the most popular is deemed to be the most true. That's basically how the algorithms work. And a lot of people can have some dumb ideas sometimes. So whatever is the most popular is not always going to be the most true. But it's also easy to spread for me and it's easy to spread for you. Because when you have the information that's coming to you in this decontextualized way, and particularly when it's like continuous scroll, continuous feed, you tend to think with your heart and not with your head. And so you can design the disinformation to really engage those feelings, right? You feel very angry and you want to share it. You feel, even if you're angry because it's not true, right? And you want to say, look at this ridiculous thing that's not true, right? And you want to spread that. You've just spread that message, right? And so we've kind of made it worse when we do that. I myself have done that. I am not immune to fake news. Yeah, so you'll see things like this. And I just kind of gave 2 examples here. This is one that I actually saw this morning. And I took the person out because he was not relevant, but he is a blue check mark certified person on Twitter. All that means is Twitter knows who you are. It doesn't mean that you're important or correct, but people use that as a standard for these are better opinions than other people's opinions. So he's saying cops committing sex crimes involving children is common. And then he has this story from LA where this happened. Because there is one story from LA that I can include, that does not make it common, right? But you see this and this, you know, they pulled out like, you know, horrible sounding quotes from it and those kinds of things, gives you that emotional kind of thing, makes it more likely that that information is going to spread. When you share this kind of thing as a blue check mark person, as a journalist, whatever, you make it so that more people see it for a couple of reasons. Number one, because the algorithm assumes that popular is better, right? And so it's more likely to actually serve it into people's feeds. And number two, people can actually cut this out, right? And they can reshare it with other people. So you can take, even when you're like trying to debunk it, if you share it exactly the way it is, people can sort of abstract it, they can screenshot it, all kinds of things like that. And you just are making it easier to share these fake messages. Here's another example from Daniel Dale, who does a sort of a preferential way, I think, of doing this. The Daniel Dale fact checker with CNN started as a amazing fact checker with the Toronto Star, came up with the idea that when you were covering a political figure who said the same untrue things at speech after speech after speech, that you could have a little spreadsheet with all of those things in that so that he could actually like fact check in real time while live tweeting stuff. He kind of came up with that method. And notice here that he took the piece of misinformation and just drew red lines over it. Makes it more difficult to share, right? So he's still doing the fact check, saying it's a fake quote with 3,200 retweets and counting. And also using the truth sandwich for this. The truth sandwich is true information. This is the false thing. Here's why it's false, right? So you're sandwiching the false information in between the true, but then making it also harder to share. So we came up with a couple of discussion questions that we would love to discuss with all of you. So you want to take the first one since that one was yours?
Well, I had a former student ask me, he was working for a medical health website. And he said, people are getting incorrect information about their health, especially during the pandemic. And he said, what kinds of advice would you give to health consumers? And I said, well, it's the old saw. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So if it is so earth-shattering or profound, going back to what our colleague in the back was saying, who else is talking about this? Is this anywhere else? Okay, or is this just one source of information? So before you take something that's reported about how to protect yourself about COVID, well, what's the Mayo Clinic have to say about this? What does the CDC have to say about this? Unfortunately, what we saw was a lot of different opinions from all those different organizations, which created confusion. But I think part of that was the deadline pressure of we have to get this information out. This is the most recent information we have. But look at reputable sources. Have they reported this? How have they reported it out? I mean, it is really tough these days where everybody is a journalist via smartphone to have good old fashioned scoops because there are so many people present and there are so many people who can share that information. So if this is only one person or only one place this is coming from, that should raise red flags and be an alarm right there.
All right.
Regarding health, I read something recently where we've got our old crisis communication that kind of get out health information, how we used to get those types of sources. But some of the most recent research out of the NIH and others is saying, and I think this is where there's a huge opportunity for local journalism again, is that people don't trust those sources. They trust the local sources. They trust the local voices. And so using those to get the messaging out, as opposed to Fauci or CDC or whoever else, which I haven't figured out where that's possible. But anyway, it seems like there's an opportunity there for local media that has been born out of this misinformation zone, right? These are the people I also, see at the grocery store or down at the Y or whatever, and that there's potential there.
I mean, I would just think back to my early journalism professors when I was getting my journalism degree is, the more sources, the better. I think often what we see missing from a lot of this helter-skelter hurry approach, where journalists do not get a lot of time to develop stories and sources, is we don't have the broader context. So if you can get those local sources to share their information, that adds context to what NIH is saying or CDC is saying. And if they're disagreeing, ask them to explain why they're disagreeing. What's been your experience? So that way you can acknowledge what those so-called national credible organizations are saying, but give your local people who may be more credible with your local audience an opportunity to say, I endorse that, I agree with it, or I discount it, or let me explain what that means.
We also have a problem with journalists who, as professional generalists, don't always understand their subjects in technical fields. And we make a lot of mistakes. My wife's in the medical profession. She's all the time telling me, don't rely on what I read in the public press about COVID, because she comes and quotes all the detailed stuff, but I read that there too. But I do see where they get twisted. And we don't help ourselves when all along, whenever they have some kind of advance, and we overhype it or misinterpret it. You don't read the studies right from their point of view. That hurts our credibility when something comes along too.
Well,
We need more professional education. We need more journalists who know their stuff.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, that's why usually most journalism programs are requiring a liberal arts background, is so that you know, a little something about a lot of areas, because you don't know what beat you're going to be assigned. But I think we can all agree that the big problem with COVID is that it got politicized.
Yeah.
And that turned, that all bets were off once that happened, because people then were able to only embrace what they wanted to, that reinforced their pre-existing attitudes. I saw that in my own family, and I'm thinking, you really believe that? And no matter what I would say, it was the old saw about when you go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, you're not talking about COVID because it was divisive.
And I'll get to you just one second. Just to follow up on what you said about the local people, I think the other problem was that the one size fits all from like the central CDC kind of perspective didn't always apply very much in some extremely rural places. I think in some places, like they really didn't have that much risk, right? And like we couldn't even have those conversations because it was so politicized. So maybe local news is where we can have those conversations.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Fascinating discussion. I think one thing that's going through my mind is what are we learning right now? I think she summed it up great, is that there are opportunities in this realm of fake news to do it the right way. Going back to local, instead of the rush to become breaking news, that we take the time to establish credibility and carve a niche as being a credible source. But what have we learned? What have you learned in the realm of fake news? What are we taking away from this?
That people need to slow way down.
That's your point.
Yeah, I think the speed is a big part of the problem, but I do think there are affordances when people get their news on social media, right? So, it's kind of my second discussion point here. But if you want people to have context, you can include that right there in the links, right? It can be really good. Like for COVID news, there's kind of this whole thing on Twitter called like sort of guild Twitter, right? And so there's like, school teacher Twitter, and there's doctor Twitter, and all those kinds of things, right? So I have lists of those kind of people, and then I can look at that, and that's where I know that like experts are, that I can get that kind of information. Like it's a double-edged sword, I think, right? Because it can be really good for sourcing, and it can be really like not good as well.
What social media, how it has changed the landscape is the amount of reach, because people have always been out producing misinformation or propaganda. It's just, you couldn't hit one button and hit an unlimited audience. You were bounded by geography in many cases, or if your radio, you're bounded by the edge of your assigned frequency. And same thing with TV, your license, if you look back at mainstream media. And so social media changed, it upended the entire landscape. And it goes back to Kung Fu, grasshopper using their powers for good and grasshoppers using their powers for not good reasons. But I don't like that term because, again, I think when you put news in it, that assigns credibility to it. And I'm not willing to do that. And I'm not a big social media user because I think most of it is just a bunch of BS, and I'm not talking brown sugar.
Yeah, we have the same deficiencies. I remember doing a study back in school of deficiencies of newspapers in the 30s. They were very similar to newspapers in the 70s. And they're very similar to newspapers in the media in 2000. We still have, among other things, the race to be first rather than be right. We still want to get it out there so quick that we don't often bet it as much as we should. We still have reliance on too few sources. We still have all kinds of things that haven't changed. The media criticism in the 1930s is the same as it is now. We've just changed some names, in some cases the media. But I went back and looked at our story of 2020. 9/11 happened on our deadline day. So we happened to be able to do a local, little brief, at least a small story on it. And I went back and looked at that story, and it was based on what was being reported at the time. And I was struck by how much of it was wrong.
Mhm.
It's what we had at the time, so I'm not apologetic, but it's so much of it was wrong. And that does not help us in the long run. But that's what was being reported.
It's difficult to carve out time for day two stories when reporters have to report across multiple platforms. We are asking more of our journalists than we ever had, and so depth and context are especially difficult to obtain. And I'm not going to sit here as somebody who teaches college students and spit down their necks, because look at what they're up against versus what I was doing. I had a 24-hour news cycle working for a daily newspaper that served a region. There was no real direct competitor. Okay. With social media, everybody's a competitor, regardless of whether they're in that community. But trying to impress upon editors and news directors the importance of day two stories and follow up and staying on the story so that those corrections can be added in updates to the story. That's really tough to do, but that's a critical part of debunking what gets this label. And as Amanda said earlier, everybody's out there on social media, so they have the same tools we have, but they're not operating under the same code of ethics that we are. And so we have to figure out as journalists, how can we be disruptors in that social media cycle? And again, I'm simple-minded, so stop using the term, stop implicitly endorsing by sharing. Even though I know it's really tempting, and I'm not an avid social media user, so you could just tell me to shut my mouth. I'll shut it myself. Bob.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've learned from this pandemic is that the facts today are not the facts tomorrow, and people don't get that. And you, again, use it against you because you learn things over time. And you can't go back and say it isn't necessarily wrong what you reported yesterday. It's just that the facts, we've learned something more, the facts are different than we thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very difficult concept to keep people understand.
As Fauci keeps emphasizing over and over again, we just follow what we know now versus what we know then. But now you got half the crowd saying he ain't worth anything because they're tired of it. But he's been saying it the same way he's been saying it right all along as far as what they got.
What's our role in media literacy?
That's kind of my bottom question.
It used to be that newspapers taught.
Is that a responsibility there?
And taught media literacy to kids.
Or is that the user? Is that their responsibility? Is our responsibility?
I think it's our responsibility because I think it has to be. I think it's a survival issue if we don't improve media literacy. I mean, I honestly do. Because people always talk about like making the platforms more accountable, right? And so the platform should adjust their algorithms and they should, deplatform certain people. And, there's big kind of First Amendment kind of conversations we can have around that kind of thing. So I think the best thing to do, and this is not original to me, but the RAND Corporation has this idea of the fire hose of falsehoods, right? Which is basically that you wear down people's psychological resistance through giving them so many pieces of conflicting information that they're just like, okay, I have no idea what's true and what's not. So I'm just going to pick the one I like the best. And they said the best thing you can do against the fire hose of falsehoods is to dress the audience in raincoats. And the raincoats are the media literacy. Now, we can try to do that, but people aren't always excited about getting those messages either.
We have always been notoriously bad at explaining why we do what we do.
Mhm.
And that's an ongoing issue that has to keep happening. Is we have to explain more about what the process is and why.
Are you suggesting you teach divisive topics in the schools?
Well, and Bob is exactly right. We are extremely resistant to showing how the sausage is made. For two reasons. We're arrogant bastards, okay? Anybody who's a journalist has that streak running through them. I don't care how humble you are, okay? And number two, we know sometimes that when the sausage is being made, it's not pretty and we don't look so good. And they see, the mess. And will they be able to distinguish the mess from the good that comes out of the mess? But I think we have to, because the audiences have said, we don't consider you, the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, regardless of whether you agree with all their content, well, we don't consider you reputable anymore. Well, who you going to call? Okay, if you're taking away those long tenured mainstream organizations that have historically been right more than they've been wrong, what are we left with?
Well, that's
The nuts who are tweeting stuff out that have no qualms about whether it's true, have no qualms about what perspective it represents, have no qualms about fooling people, deliberately misleading people. That's what's left, and that's the biggest slop trough out there.
But the thing is, we're the local paper. We should be having a higher credibility than the national.
You should, and research says you do. That is still your franchise.
Yeah.
So I actually did a study about that, about breaking news coverage on social media and who was more accurate, parachuting in national outlets and local outlets. Local outlets are substantially more accurate,
People hate the parachute journalists, absolutely hate.
but people watch them. I mean, local people hate them.
To hate them, they watch them to hate them and disagree with them.
Yeah, but I feel like that's another affordance of social media, though, is it's a way that you can give people an idea behind the scenes of how stories come together. And there are some reporters who are really good at that. But we don't do that as much on the local level, I don't think. But we could.
Well, even when they're not parachuting, they're rotating doors. Our daily is less credibility because reporters come and go so fast, they never learn the community.
Mhm.
And they show up now and then at a meeting because they got so much to cover. Our smaller audience do the same things over and over again and know it. They know what's going on and they don't. And so it's all kinds of stuff they print. And so they don't have the credibility. So even when you live there, you can screw it up if you're just gonna stay there to go on to the next bigger job down the line.
We used to have local news commentary. I mean, Robin built his career in local news. We don't see local commentary anymore. We see people talking about, well, this is what we saw on Twitter and we thought y'all would find it funny because we sure did. It's a cute little kitty. Could we take a minute to have a thoughtful commentary where an issue in the newsroom, an ethical dilemma, or this is why we didn't report this at this time, editorials, commentaries, columns, opportunities are there, but we're not taking advantage of them. And I had a publisher tell me one time, I didn't stay there very long, it was 2.5 months, and there were other things going on in my life, but I argued against releasing full disclosure about this information until police had actually arrested this person based on what we knew, and it was a potentially inflammatory charge. And then when the other media organizations in the community did it, he said, we're just going to do it. And I said, well, why don't we write an editorial explaining why we showed restraint? He said, no, we're not going to explain what we do. Well, maybe people would have found it informative that we had an ethical discussion and why we didn't do it. For those who wondered, well, gee, why didn't they put that information out there when TV and the competing alternative newspaper happened? Why didn't they? They're just a bunch of lazy sloths.
Electronic media regulation took away the fairness.
Yeah, need is contextual there. Need it for policy purposes or need it to survive as a media organization.
No longer a requirement for license.
Yeah,
Them's of us who do first. Amendment.
yeah.
said good riddance.
Yeah, I got quoted this statistic not long ago to some students. I said, back in the 90s, I was at an SPJ National, and the guy, Hubbard Broadcasting, that, you know, later birthed Dish Network. I think he said this, you know, people are always going to need local news because they need something to wrap a fish in, but I'm not sure if he was the one who said this or if somebody else. It all kind of blurs together after a while, but it was that pig farmers in the early 1990s spent more money on research and development than news organizations did. Pig farmers in the 1990s. And now we're all sitting here going, oh my gosh, how did mainstream media collapse? We did it to ourselves. It was intentional, neglectful suicide. And now we're trying to figure out how to fix it. And why is it hard? It was a slow, long, painful death. And it's going to be a slow, long, painful rebirth in this new media landscape. And so that's why we need to have these discussions with young people. That's what we're trying to do. Please do it with your interns, those of you working in the media, because they're the ones who will determine the new media landscape. And we need to make sure that they have the tools, not just the toys, but the tools, the professional standards, and the ethics to make that media landscape in a way that's going to be meaningful to their audiences, the communities they're serving. We need your help.
One of the problems is, Kelly Laws, right?
Mhm.
Former SPJ national president.
Great community
Runs-
editor and reporter.
in Indiana, runs 7 or 8 newspapers out of a single newsroom now.
Mhm.
Okay, and so they have common coverage, but they're not really covering
Mhm.
each of the towns the way they used to with it.
Mhm.
Gotta be some way to
Mhm.
The map, the front page, in
Yeah.
front of boilerplate.
Yeah, and I know we're in a lot of sense preaching to the choir because they're business decisions that newsroom journalists are not part of, but that have effects on them. But, you know, work with research specialists such as Amanda and get data and say, you know, here's what's happening to our audience. And here's what we're doing. Do you think maybe we should change what we're doing and see what happens to these numbers? Because numbers, we know, are all the business office understands.
One thing we're doing simultaneously. I specialized in editorial pages and editorials, and years ago, we had a conference at which we looked ahead to what the internet was going to do to us, and we were kind of laughed at this. We're going to be the same, and of course it isn't. It came as we thought, but we ironically have more opinion now than we ever have, at least labeled. I go watch the sites, but then we've got this trend where you say journalism is supposed to be advocacy and is no longer objective. We've screwed up our basic reporting and thrown in the opinion. And now who knows what, everybody's got an opinion and nobody's got any facts
Mhm.
as far as the public's concerned.
Mhm.
And when you can stand and go into a convenience mart, which I have, and the cashier shows me the news of the world with the little alien on the front and asks me if that's true, we got a problem.
So there's an idea from like the theory around media industry called the idea of functional displacement, right? So if you think about, like, there used to be radio dramas when radio was still new, and that was like your Netflix at the time, right? It was War of the Worlds or whatever. And when television came into being, radio had to change in order to survive. I think we're seeing the same thing with news media, that we're in a period of functional displacement because our function used to be that we controlled access to information that people couldn't get in other ways, right? We got the press passes and we had control of the airwaves and all of those kind of things. We no longer have that. Go ahead.
Benjamin swings, what are we learning? What can we take from our past to prepare us for the future?
That we need to come up with another reason for existing, right? Our reason is not to control limited access information. So what do we do for the audience now? Why should people still pay us to exist?
I think one of the reasons for successes of some of the startups are the long form reporting that they are deliberately doing instead of, and I sat through, my gluteus maximus was the most defined muscle in my body during my time as a reporter, because I sat through some school board meetings that started one day on the calendar and ended the next. And I kid you not. Okay. And then you couple an hour drive you add an hour drive on that. But in their local communities, going for depth about key issues rather than the scattershot, buckshot approach of where we're going to grab this car wreck here and we're going to grab this fire here and so on and so forth, because they recognize people are going to see those things on other people's social media posts, right? If there's a bad wreck in your neighborhood, it's going to get out. So is that really our role? Our role is analysis and context. That's what we bring. Those are our superpowers.
It's a little bit of both.
And so we need to be
Don't do
focusing
something
on that.
you get hurt too. You do what you're right on what you're saying, but you can't ignore the daily life stuff either. Because how's this? How many folks saw the Oscars, the slap, and all that stuff? How many folks have been reading stories about it ever since to see, to be reaffirmed what they saw already? And that goes for most of it, but we still have an psychological advantage. It's just, people want to read about what they saw or what they heard, and we still have a chance to come in, tail it in and add more, which is what you would like to do, is add more depth.
Well, nobody's going to be reading your newspaper to find out more about the slap, with all respect. They're going to be reading your newspaper to find out
They're
what's
gonna
going
read
on
the story.
in your community.
They're gonna read the story.
Yeah. So what's the value added portion of your implied contract with your readers and subscribers? Is you're going to give them things they cannot get anywhere else.
Right.
And you best know your community. So I always did, when I worked as a daily newspaper reporter, I always had a series of some sort I was working on. That was my pet soul food project. And when I wasn't doing the blow by blow of being a general assignment reporter in 2 rural counties, 3 at portions, I was trudging along. And so I would have at least one a year, a special series I had really worked on to try to give depth and analysis and perspective on something that I thought would be important to the community. It can be done. It can be done. We just have to determine whether we want to be deliberate in the attempt, and figuring out how to use the few resources that we have as strategically as possible.
I think that's a place where you can work with social media. I'm more pro social media than you are, I think.
Well, it has its benefits.
But you can do things like when you're waiting on the school board meeting to start, right? You can do a quick Instagram live from it. Like, I'm here live at the school board meeting and here's the things they're going to discuss and here's why they're important, right? Just right at the start of that. And then you can take good notes for a longer form story later. You can be real creative how you do that kind of thing, showing that behind the scenes kind of thing, but also giving more than just the what, but also the so what for the audience.
Is the expectations of publishers and editors and program directors saying that you need to have a 24/7 presence on social media first?
Oh, 100%. Well, I mean, you saw the New York Times change their policy just this week, right? Yeah, there's a lot of problems with that. And there's also problems, like if like you at the newspaper and the 2 TV stations in town are all covering the same school board meeting, maybe that's a missed opportunity. Maybe you need to cover it like sports, right? And so like maybe one person is doing like the context behind the decisions and one's doing like the blow by blow of what people are saying. And one is, providing all the links to stuff or something like that. But, working more collaboratively to cover the community. I don't know if these directors and editors would go for that, but I do think it would be helpful for the readers to have that.
Well, I'm going to sound like the dark side, but the dark side makes money. And the dark side knows what it's doing. Okay. What's your brand? What's your brand in your community? What sets you apart? That's what you need to exploit. That's what you need to exploit. And if they can get their high school football scores from somewhere else, why should you be spending an hour, 2 hours getting high school football scores? You would be better off.
Cut it out from.
You'd be better off doing a content sharing agreement where you pay $50 a month for somebody to get you the high school scores than spending 2 to 3 hours once a week. Yeah, but be a disruptor, and think about those new ways that Amanda's talking about to
Reach your audience where they
Yeah.
are.
reach,
Is what it is.
reach your audience with information that's credible. We're getting a little bit off track by panel here, but reach your audience as a credible source in the community. You have to think in disruptive ways. And I'm an old dinosaur. Imagine how hard it is for me to say that, John.
Well, you mentioned disruptor. You remind me of Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma. He describes how new technologies nibble away at the franchise of successful companies. In his case, he starts with the computer disks. In the beginning, computer disks were the size of an LP record, and they're the size of a 45 RPM record. And finally, small enough to put in your pocket. And people that made the first computer disks were specialists, and that's all they made. And then they made better disks and picked up the bigger market. Eventually, they changed what people could do with computers, and the people that were making those big old hard drives were gone, because the new technology took away the market from the old technology. The same thing has happened to our newspaper business, our news business. The social media are disseminating information that we used to create through a very laborious older technology. And I wonder if letting the football scores go to somebody else, well, maybe somebody else, whoever that is, decides, well, I'm not just going to do football scores, I'm also going to do the school building business. And maybe I'll add the town council and so forth. Maybe they're going to become the news disseminator, and what are we going to do?
Or the school board control the message by tweeting it out themselves.
Well, that's that functional displacement, right? That's the functional displacement question, right? Where do we innovate so that we continue to add value?
That's right.
Right. So I think it can be things like whatever happens at the school board, whatever the votes are that they take, right? They can tweet that out themselves. But I'm the one who can tell you, oh, maybe, X reader, you didn't really pay attention at election time and you don't really follow all this news, but now everyone's all hot and bothered about CRT, right? And so, people are going to meetings and they're yelling. And so I'm the one who can tell you, here's what this issue is. Here's the people in town who have real opinions on this issue and what they've done in the past, right? I can give you all of that background stuff. And I don't really need to tell you that they voted on a contract for recycling bins for the high school or whatever, that can come from somewhere else. Yeah.
It's also the shared awareness of who's reading home. Our daily, the Raleigh News and Observer did print an editorial about Spring Hope with its 200,000 circulation or whatever it is, and everybody Spring Hope people, oh, we got mentioned, but nothing would happen. I could print an editorial and did, and change what happened. not because I was better than they were or smarter than they were or whatnot, but I was the paper their neighbors were reading.
Right.
And it made a big impact. So your localness is one of your major strengths, and your credibility along with your news is part. You got to have a strong front page and a strong editorial page, and they got to work together.
But anybody can watch the live stream of the school board meeting, right? But not everybody knows the community like you do. Go ahead.
Kind of adding to what you said about like functional displacement, like social media is like the easiest way to see like what a community values, like through like polls or comments, or to see how posts do like their likes. And I think that's one of the easiest ways to see what people find important in the stories to cover. So if you are listening to your audience and really engaging with them, that makes you a lot more valuable to them because you're covering things that they care about. Whereas normally it's just a one-way form. We're giving you news. Now we have a more two-way form of kind of like communication where we can actually hear how we're doing, how we can improve in an instantaneous way that we have.
Absolutely. You know, and it used to be back when the media had money that they used to be like really invested in their communities, right? They'd be sponsoring all the local events and they'd have readers panels and all kinds of stuff. And we don't do that anymore because there's just not enough people or enough money. But social media is a way that we can kind of get back in the conversation with the readers.
It's a free focus group. Yeah, but I would say as devil's advocate, and a role I play very well, is people don't know how important something is if they don't know about it, period, to their lives. So that's valuable to an extent. But what we would hope that the local journalists know is that backstory of why this is important. Why should you vote for this excess levy? What does it mean? And the way that a school board that I covered it pitched the story idea, and the way I wrote about it was one of the benefits was it would eliminate fundraising. So little Johnny and little Susie aren't bringing candy home that you have to sell to the neighbors and pizza kits and all of those things. And that was one of the things that the school superintendent had enough political savvy to know that that would be an important thing that would curry favor with the voters. And ultimately, the levy was approved. And that was one of the things that people in the community said, whoo, you know, I'm willing to pay a little more in property taxes if I don't have to sell pizza kits with my kids to everybody in the neighborhood. And I've got a freezer full of them already. Okay. So again, that being able to place in context, that being able to tell you why, that being able to tell you why you should care, it is a franchise. And I think that goes a long way to educating at large beyond media literacy, your community. I don't know about you, Amanda, but my biggest fight is to try to stop toys from overtaking content. Because we have cool toys in journalism. We really do. I mean, now with drones, it's like, you know, we work in a fun, cool business because our toys are pretty cool. Okay. And the TV people's toys are really cool, right? Back there in the back. Yeah. And my biggest fight is to stop toys from superseding the value of content and the professional standards exercised to get to that content. And I think if every newsroom in this country is honest, they'll say they're fighting the same thing. It's we've got to be this, we've got to be this, we've got to be this because of the tools and the technologies, but we're not thinking about what our bread and butter has historically been, is making sure that our community members know what's going on and that they have confidence in us as sources, getting back to the whole fake news thing, which is where we started a few minutes ago. And establishing ourselves as a place where people can have confidence in the content, and where if they see something that they're going, really? They're going to say, what's your paper's name? Okay, let's see what these people, let's see what the Enterprise has to say about this issue. I just saw this tweet.
Yeah, I think social media feedback is both a blessing and a curse. Because it does tell you things about the community, but it also may give you a very distorted view of what is coming out of the most vocal side of any issue. So you have to be really careful about how you use that to figure out what's really going on.
Well, I meant more in the terms of not necessarily people commenting, but like, you can also see what is like relevant by how many shares it gets, how many retweets it gets, which isn't necessarily somebody commenting, but it's something that these people care about. And I think like, that's a good way to prioritize like what your community values, so that we're not following the horse race of like, oh, we're trying to be the first, but we can really dissect what this community values, cover it in full depth and dedicate that time when we can really see, even if it's not an accurate description of like how everyone feels. If a population that's very vocal about it is saying it, you know, maybe it's good to address, because they're the people that are going to be dragging you on Twitter if you don't bring it up. So those people, while they aren't as accurate, they can also do a lot of damage because they're the ones.
You're exactly right, because that's how that tool is used. But people also like cute kitty videos. You know, is that the role of news media? I mean, I cringe when I watch one of the big networks, 6:30 anchor newscast, and they take 30 seconds to a minute to show a cute kitty video. Is that really how you want to use a part of your most valuable real estate? And even though we've seen fragmentation of audiences and segmentation of audiences, the big three network news at 6:30 still draw a big chunk of audience.
And there's a Facebook counterpart, which is the noisy machinery doing showy stuff.
But is it the news that report? We need those kickers, because otherwise we're giving our audiences additional stress that could turn into a major health issue.
And novelty has always been a part of news. It's what gets you to the third block, right? So that's just gonna be there. Otherwise, why would we all know about a rabid fox on the White House lawn, right?
Well, the rabbit fox on the White House lawn was somebody doing original reporting. I mean, a cute kitty video is just a cute kitty video.
But that's still what the audience could value. And like, that could be something that they look forward to, like something that you could connect with them with. So even if it doesn't necessarily be as robust or compelling, like if that's something that the audience values, like they'll acknowledge that and potentially go back to that because you are appealing to what they like.
And sometimes you need a break from.
Yeah, I think it's the type of news report. Does it have to be all lead and lead, or should we start focusing on good stories? Because there are a lot of good stories out there.
One of my favorite stories from Rhoda, long time ago, was a story about when we first got here. It was kind of like we're coming from Richmond, where it was murder kind of thing. And we got here, the big news was that there was 4th of July or some sort of a baseball game. And the baseball game had fireworks at the same night that there was a dog show. It was on the Civic Center. And like, so these show dogs ended up getting loose all over the community because they're freaking out about the fireworks. That's just awesome. That's news.
But that didn't come from social media. That was original reporting.
Well, that's because there wasn't social media at the time, but if there was, that would have been all over the place.
Yeah.
And it still would have been great.
Well, I still think there are great people doing great things in your community. Find them. Find those unsung heroes. Find those people who make sure that, the flag goes up every morning at the post office or at the county courthouse. I mean, those are great little stories that don't take a lot of depth, and that reinforces what your local franchise is. Cute kitty video, I mean, yeah, put it on your website. But, if you've got a chance, feature your community. That's what people want to know and see. I'm sorry, I really believe in local news.
The fox on the Capitol lawn was an environmental story. Okay. Quite frankly, and it should have been.
It was good stuff.
Not
One more, and then we're gonna go back to fake news.
Because having
Good
wild
discussion.
animals in the middle of that city is
It's a
environmental.
good local story. Professor Sturgill.
Yes.
Suppose we've got a good local story going on, and whatever our platform is, we're treating it on social media. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of feedback on that. On the platform. How can we sniff out whether there's a bot generating that feedback?
Tell kind of what they comment. It kind of sounds stupid sometimes, or you can see their profile. Like it's like, I don't know, Pepsi lover 42 commenting the same thing like over and over again, like follow my account for a free pair of sunglasses or something. Like those are normally the bots posts. It's kind of hard to, they're very hard to actually pick real people with their personalities. So those are some of the easier to spot, but like social media is going to happen regardless. So if you don't take advantage of it, you may get lost. Not finding those stories won't gain as much traction as they could. So like while it may be bad, you have to kind of embrace the new technology because like people are going to do it, and your stories might just get lost at the bottom because people.
If the comments are repetitive, there's a chance that it's a bot. There's services like Bot or Not, or that's the one I can think of right now, that you can actually put in a username and it'll tell you the likelihood that it's an automated account. If the account has a mismatch between the profile picture and the account description, or if it has a very vague account description, it's often a bot.
Repetitive mismatch.
Really, if there's 0 followers, like
New accounts, yeah, that have just been made. There's other like more advanced things you can do. There's ways you can tell the profile pictures are AI generated and stuff like that. But yeah, okay, so we are getting close to out of time, but we did want to leave you with 2 ideas for resources. So you can go ahead first.
Okay. First Draft is an organization that is training people about these very issues. It's with the Craig Newmark School at City University of New York. They've been on our campus a couple of times, one to do election training and then one just general instances of misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. You can log into their toolkit at this address. It's a bit.ly. It's bit.ly/first draft toolkit. First draft toolkit. It's a great place to start looking and finding out how to use a lot of these online tools that are available and how to use parts of apps to check information and verify information. So that's bit.ly/first draft toolkit, all one word.
All right, and then mine. I actually wrote a book on training people to be able to spot those kind of logic problems when public figures are trying to say bad things for you. It is a self-working book, but it has examples from throughout American history. And if you're interested in that, or following me on Twitter where I do tweet about misinformation, I have lovely cards and you're welcome to have one. So great. I think we are pretty close to the end of time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all.